Greetings, fellow Kerbonauts. Welcome to Kerbal Space Program. My name is Rice, and this is the Minimalist Shuttle Program, episode 15. So now we are at that certain stage in the game where we need to launch some heavier payloads into orbit. And by heavier payloads, I mean we need to get some 2.5 meter parts into space. Now, I do realize that earlier in the series, I did mention that we were primarily going to be using 1.25 meter parts in space, or whatever could fit inside the cargo bay of our smaller space shuttles. However, I came to realize that if we ever intend to go someplace beyond the Mun, primarily Duna or some of the other planets, we're going to need some heftier parts. Part of the reason being is that when we build the spacecraft capable of going on interplanetary missions, we want to be able to reduce the part counts. And unfortunately, if we intend to build interstellar spacecraft, well, interplanetary spacecraft with 1.25 meter parts, the part count is going to get a little bit larger. So it's that weird little dichotomy in that when we build crafts with larger parts, the part count tends to be a little bit less versus smaller parts because we need more fuel, more equipment. It tends to increase the part count. So we're going to bend the rules a little bit, and we're going to be using space shuttles that could ferry 2.5 meter parts into orbit. Now, ferrying larger parts into orbit means we need a brand new space shuttle. So allow me to introduce the Heavy Shuttle. Composed of just 27 parts and weighing in at a hefty 22 tons, this shuttle has the capability to ferry 14 tons into orbit. Now, for our shuttle orbiter's maiden mission, we will be launching a second spacecraft that we will be putting around Kerbal orbit. Now, we're going to go ahead and time jump here as we get ourselves situated into a 150-kilometer altitude, which is going to be the perfect position for us to situate our second Kerbal-orbited spacecraft. And it is at this point that we use primarily our RCS thrusters in order to situate ourselves into as close a circularized orbit as we can get it here. We want to make sure that we don't have too much deviation in our spacecraft's orbit here when we release our payload. And looks like we're looking pretty good. So now we can go ahead and begin the process of opening up our cargo bay. Okay, so doors are now open. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to go ahead and have Bill here, our resident space engineer, pop on out to inspect our cargo before we release it into orbit. Now what we have here is our new REMO module, or resupply module. Bigger, more expanded. Using those 2.5 meter parts, we can now build something along the lines of a larger, more efficient refueling station. Now, the Kerbal National Space Station we're going to continue to use for vehicles that will ferry cargo to the Mun. However, for this specific REMO module, this resupply module, we're going to be using this one to resupply vehicles en route to planets like Duna and Dres and various other outer solar system anomalies and planets and space bodies and all that fun stuff. Now, it is at this point that Bill makes an interesting discovery and reports it back to Mission Control. But what I mean by that is I make the interesting discovery that this REMO module doesn't have any RCS thrusters on it. Normally I put RCS thrusters on space stations and orbiting craft so that I can adjust its orbit, but this vehicle unfortunately doesn't have the capability to adjust its orbit with those lack of RCS thrusters. So I have to be absolutely sure, and I hope I'm absolutely sure that this is the right orbit that we're going to be putting this vehicle on. So we're just going to have to make do. At some point, though, I'll probably attach another module with some sort of maneuvering thruster capabilities on it so that we can fine-tune the adjustments of this vehicle here. Because this space stations and other spacecraft that tend to just sit in orbit to refuel other vehicles, they get docked on a whole lot, obviously, of course. But when you dock, this game has a tendency to accidentally change the orbit of spacecraft and space stations due to that little jolt when you dock two vehicles together. So you need those RCS thrusters to readjust. And now it's time to time jump and scooch ahead at 5 times speed while we begin the re-entry process for our space shuttle here. Now, unfortunately, this isn't one of my better re-entries, as I overshot the Kerbal Space Center and we had to turn around and pull a little bit of a loop here and to try to get back to the runway. And as you can see here, Bobble, our newest pilot to our astronaut space corps, expressions of disbelief, a little bit of panic there as he attempts to try to wrestle with the controls to get this shuttle in proper alignment here. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to hit the runway. So Bobble pulls back a little bit on the stick here. With a little bit of flaring, we're going to try to get ourselves just as close to the runway as we possibly can. So here we are. We're coming right down onto the field. Perfect. Okay, then we smack the brakes. Now, with the newest addition to our space shuttle fleet safely at home at the Kerbal Space Center, it's now time to zip on over to our Mun space station and undock our Mooner shuttle and get it ready to head back home to Kerbin here. Sitting at the controls, we've got good old Jebediah and resident space engineer Lemony. Alright, so we've got our RCS thrusters full on. Getting ourselves away from the station. Perfect. Alright, so station maintenance is pretty much done. We've expanded the space station quite substantially since our first couple trips to the Mun. As you can see there, we now have a utility module attached. We have a little bit of a habitation module. And then we have our fuel and RCS module attached to that station. A lot smaller than the Kerbal National Space Station, but now it is completely functional. Alright. Here we go. So we got ourselves turned over, and we're going to get ourselves ready to head on back to Kerbin. Now, scooching ahead at a whopping 60 kilonewtons of thrust off of that one nuclear engine, we make our way from the Mun over to Kerbin. Now, with the Mooner shuttle, making our way back home is going to involve a couple extra steps here. First off, we need to hit the atmosphere of Kerbin to slow ourselves down so that we can get ourselves into a stable orbit. Then after that, we dock with the Kerbal National Space Station, and then we return that nuclear engine that we borrowed off the Kerbal National Space Station and redock it back to the station, and then, and only then, do we return the shuttle back to the Kerbal Space Center. So it's a fairly involved process. And now we move along to probably the most tedious part of the mission, and that is a series of cuts where we enter the atmosphere and we bring down our apoaps so that we can make our orbit a little less elliptical and circularize our orbit just a bit more. And then we jump back again, come to the apoaps of our orbit, and then after we hit our apoaps, we slowly lift our periaps just out of the atmosphere, just slightly still in the atmosphere, but not as deep as before, so that we can aerobrake a little bit less, save ourselves some fuel. And then we come back in again to the atmosphere where we lower our apoaps into the atmosphere, out of the atmosphere, circularizing our orbit, then recircularizing our orbit, then back in the atmosphere again. So this takes a little bit of patience. However, the payoff in the end is that eventually we get ourselves into enough of a circularized orbit that we can intercept the Kerbal National Space Station. And now here we are, we're up to the station, and now all we gotta do is we gotta dock. And this is probably the least tedious part, at least for me, because as you've probably heard before, I absolutely love docking. Probably you, the viewers out there, aren't as enthusiastic about docking as I am, so I went ahead and sped up the video here at 5 times speed while we bring ourselves into the space station here. Now this is a pretty textbook dock here. Nice, simple, and easy here, as our renowned space pilot here, Jebediah, has probably done this many a time, well experienced. You could probably fall asleep at the controls here and still manage to pull this dock off. Anyways, we got a couple more meters left to go here, and we will be docking at 180 degrees with respect to our docking guide. Almost there, just a few more meters to go. And, oh, here we go, here we go. Perfect. Okay, and we are now docked with the space station. Now declare this mission complete. In the next video, we'll be launching more space shuttles in our quest to conquer space. Until then, we will see you all next time.